I'm Dr. Mark Gold, and this is the Gold Standard. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Kosten, who is the Vice Chair for Research at Baylor College of Medicine and the Director of the Division of Alcohol and Addiction Psychiatry, the Co-Director of the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, and also works in a variety of different departments within the medical school and has had just an amazing career. I follow him, and we've had the chance to do some talks together, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today on the gold standard. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction.
You had so many titles, I couldn't get them all in, and I appreciate that because when I worked for Wayne Goodman, he gave me a lot of titles too. Um, so I have like a whole list of questions just from your fantastic career and things that I use all the time and think about. So let's start with um, you were at Yale and trained there, did an internship at Greenwich because I was still there at the time, and then your residency and continued with great mentors, and then went to Texas. Is that, without giving all the details, is that about right?
That's about right. 50 years summarized.
It's sad. It is like, well, ChatGPT and the other AI services do that. They're like, what's the highlights? And you read it and you go like, I can't believe they put my whole career in like a paragraph.
Yes.
But they're big things. So, like for me, um, when we were looking at impaired health professionals and their treatment for addiction, we said, as Bob DuPont and I and Lisa Merlo and Tom McClellan, we said, like, let's look in the literature for who who looks at outcomes. And you and Herb Kleber looked at outcomes in the 80s. You reported it was 2 or 3 year outcomes for people um, being treated for cocaine use disorder and opioid use disorder, um, which is amazing because I could be wrong, but I've rarely seen a 5 year outcome. I haven't seen a 2.5 year outcome recently.
They were a thing of the past to a certain extent, in that you really had to have some sustained funding from a source. In this case, it was, the early days of National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they were willing to fund these longitudinal studies, which initially were people primarily on methadone. Then later on, we did ones with some people on naltrexone. We did also then, as you said, the cocaine abusers who, in general, often were on a variety of medications because there was no methadone equivalent. And of course, later on, there was the buprenorphine for opiates. But it's a shame to a certain extent that longitudinal studies just don't get the support that one might like to have hundreds of people that you follow for 5 6 years, and you see what happens to them. And it's often very informative about how treatment can work and how it can work for a sustained period if you have in my opinion, some kind of medication that really retains them in treatment and that they find stabilizes them both medically, psychologically, and of course in their behaviors, so that they're not chasing drugs down all the time.
Yeah, I mean, your work in this area um, is about the only thing that people can reference when, I mean, I know I was working as the editor of the addiction medicine section of Up to Date for 10 years, and people would say to me, well, how do you know methadone works? And I would have your paper with Bruce and Herb, and that was about it.
There were some other studies, but you're right. That was one that was probably one of the most systematic at the time, and that while it wasn't a follow-up on a 5-year randomized clinical trial, it was a very comprehensive follow-up. We were surprised what a large percentage of the patients we could find. And a lot of that has to be giving credit to methadone, which would in fact retain people very
Right.
well. And that's something that treatment, if you can't retain the patients, you certainly can't get them any better. So important consideration.
Well, it's a great one. And the if we look at that, when people ask you like what's the 2.5 or 5 year outcome on methadone in terms of treatment retention versus buprenorphine, what would you say?
Well, it's sad to say to a certain extent that buprenorphine has in fact opened up opiate treatment much more than methadone was able to do, if for no other reason that people desire it more. There's much more freedom associated with it in the sense of legal restrictions and things like that. It's a medication that you can give a month's supply of someone to, early on in treatment. A month's supply would never happen in methadone, and even getting just having to come in only a few days a week was something that you had to earn over a relatively long period of time, and that reflects a lot of things. But one of the things that happens from that is that our retention on buprenorphine has never been quite as good as it can be on methadone. But if you ask people coming in the front door, would you rather be on methadone maintenance or buprenorphine? Buprenorphine wins hands down. And it's usually either that people had been on methadone before, and so they did well and they want to do it again, or they've done buprenorphine several times, and it really is clear they need much more structure introduced into their life right from the get-go, which methadone certainly does. So I think that ideally it would be buprenorphine retention. Buprenorphine has a staying power and a returning power that is just as good as methadone. I think that the use of buprenorphine, I would guess, is at least 3 to 4 to maybe even 10 times more than it is with this buprenorphine than with methadone. And of course, there's injectable forms of buprenorphine now that you can just give once a month, and the people, there's no diversion possibility. It's active all the time, whether they in fact, take it every day or not. And it looks like for some of the higher doses of that injected buprenorphine, it does something that the sublingual buprenorphine and methadone don't do, which is it really can block some of fentanyl effects. And fentanyl has been the real killer of people in the last 10, 15 years. So that there's a lot of things that have improved. I think that people are willing to come back to buprenorphine, so it may take 3 tries at it before they really stick with it. But that's better than they're dead, or that they're in
Sure.
fact just running around the streets.
So there's a lot in that. So let's start with the methadone. I mean, if methadone was as available as buprenorphine and had the same general rules about office administration, would that ratio still be in effect of who prefers what?
I think that that's a fascinating question. And that the question, of course, comes often down to diversion, that
Hmm.
methadone is more divertible than is buprenorphine because you can take it a variety of different, you can take it orally, you can take it by injection, whatever, and it gives you a high, which buprenorphine doesn't necessarily do. If you take it by injection, uh, the bigger the dose of buprenorphine you take, the more it's blocking even itself. So, which is not, of course, what happens with methadone. The more you
Right.
take, the bigger the high you might get, and the tolerance issue becomes quite real of withdrawal symptoms. Whereas the taper, the discontinuation of buprenorphine is not quite as dramatic. That is, that people get withdrawal symptoms, but not as badly. So I think that to try to compare methadone and buprenorphine, and could they both be put into the same kind of much less restrictive dispensing system? I don't know that that would work. I mean, it would work for some people on methadone. I've had
Hmm.
patients who've been on methadone for 30 years and they don't need very high dosages. They
Right.
sometimes are just 25, 30
25 mil.
milligrams. While they're on it, they seem to be perfectly fine. It's as if they have, endogenous opiate deficiency disease. When you fix it, it's like diabetes. They're fixed. But if you stop it, they are not at all fixed. And so that 20% or so of people that, you know, would stay on it, you could probably give them a month's supply and they would just use it for themselves. They wouldn't have that much to divert, you might say, since the abuse liability comes usually at higher dosages than that. So I don't think that there's any way we'll ever, have, say, buprenorphine taking over completely for what's methadone. And I'm not sure how much more looser we could make methadone regulation and yet have it not become a problem like it started to become early on in its use, where there was a
Hmm.
fair amount of
Sure.
abuse of methadone also. I mean, methadone abuse now is just not that common, which is, great because
Good.
and and the abuse, unfortunately, of things like fentanyl are really quite problematic because fentanyl, I don't want to say easily, but relatively easily will override methadone's, cross tolerance. So it's methadone is not the best for anybody who you're thinking is only partially motivated, that their motivation is to, not get sick, or their motivation is to perhaps not overdose because it's it's too easy to overdose. So it's just, I see us in a happy medium right now of these various medications that are available.
Well, that's really helpful. And I'll have to pass over the endogenous opioid deficiency syndrome since I've written about that since I don't know, Herb and I in biomedicine in '78. It's one of the things that has always stuck with me that there's a reason that people who have developed opioid use disorders tell you that they feel better with exogenous opioids than when they're drug-free or on naltrexone. And it's yet to be proven what that is, but maybe with smart guys like you'll be able to figure it out.
Well, I think that, when I was at Rockefeller with Dolan Nicewander and Mary Jean Creek, Vincent Dole was basically, he's a liver guy, but he thought of himself in terms of endocrinology and diabetes and was considering opiate dependence along the lines of diabetes, deficiency in insulin. I think that, when we did find endogenous opiates and we certainly found mu opiate receptors and have now found a whole cascade of second messenger systems, which are probably quite different. We know they're quite different when you're maintained on opiates, but they're, even if it's 20%, let's say, of
Hmm.
people who become opiate dependent, no one has had that longitudinal study from early on where you could look
Right.
at what is that deficiency. It's not been as easy as, not that, diabetes is an easy disease, but not as easy as, diabetes and insulin and the receptors that insulin has effects on.
Well, that's really good. And let just quickly, where would naltrexone fit in your mind as a t treatment for opioid use disorder? We've used it, of course, in impaired health professionals, but they have so much motivation to take it, and maybe some titans of industry have motivations to take it, but other people would certainly choose buprenorphine.
Yes, I think that the key about naltrexone is just what you point out, motivation. It's for opiate dependence. It doesn't do anything in the sense that,
Yeah,
if you take opiates, nothing happens, but it doesn't make you feel great. Other
right.
than you're not having withdrawal symptoms anymore once you go through the detox. And I think that you do need a fairly strong external motivator, like physicians, and I'm sure the sort of thing you've probably also done of having them sign a letter giving up their medical license that you put in your desk drawer and you say, keep taking the naltrexone or guess where this is going. And that they are motivated. So I
Yeah, that's a funny part about being in Florida was, when people are arguing about involuntary commitment, well, we have involuntary commitment for people with substance use disorders. It's called the Marchman Act, and I used to be on the board of the Marchman Center as an African American minister, and who basically was thinking, well, gee, doctors, you have leverage, it's coercion, or professional athletes, you have coercion, or a publicly traded banker company, you have coercion. But for a regular person in Florida, you don't have coercion, and we could certainly use the leverage. And so, do you have that in Texas?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up that that some people think coercion is a bad thing. Well, I don't agree with that. And the examples of it that are not doctors, lawyers, or Indian chiefs are in our drug. Is essentially a veteran level kind of intervention done by the drug courts
Oh,
where
drug court.
the judges don't want the person to be on methadone.
Right.
Most of them don't even settle for buprenorphine, but they all like naltrexone. And so if they take naltrexone, particularly monthly injections of it, they can in fact stay out of jail for a whole variety of infractions that they may have. But in general, those programs have done quite well, even though it's a threat of something that's
Right.
coercive. Nobody especially wants to go to jail.
Right.
Although, ironically, I can remember when we'd have a residential program, which was very much drug free, and they were very harsh discipline, you might say, that half of the substance abusers who were given the option to go to or the residential program or go to jail would rather go to jail. And
Yeah.
just tell
Uh,
you something.
yeah. I think our doctors kind of might say the same. It's we put in charge of the program now a recovering crack addict physician who's now got 30 years sobriety, made it to full professor, and he's the head of the program. He's got both the learned experience and the lived experience, and he can be pretty tough. And I bet you people might choose jail over him.
Yeah, no, I was when I asked them, well, why the ones that were really honest about it said, well, quite frankly, you'll never get any drugs, and not never going to get heroin inside your residential program. But I know how to do that in jail. I mean, it was really quite, oh God.
Well, that's kind of will take me if I've got opioids and opioid treatment covered. Now, of course, you did mention injectables, and some of the doctors may not know what the injectables are or how to get people on them or if there's comparable reimbursement as Suboxone. Could you quickly just mention your experience there?
Yeah, I think the Suboxone's a good example of this, where there's another version of it also now that so you could sort of pick or choose between the two. But the issues are that the injectable is just a lot more expensive than is the sublingual tablets,
Hmm.
and that economic argument has, I think, for the beginning of the availability of Sublocade, what was defeating it. Eventually, it became clear that if you keep people taking the medication, they will do a lot better. They'll have less emergency room visits, less legal problems. They'll stay at their job. They'll pay their taxes. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons to do this. So that even in the VA system, where I've spent a lot of years, we eventually got it to the point where, as long as the provider felt that the patient would do better with the injectable, that we could get it through the system. But that's not true everywhere. And I think that this we'll spend infinite amounts of money on all kinds of medical disorders, but that when we have very effective ways of providing an addiction treatment like Suboxone, or in this case, Sublocade, um, the pushback on it is really, you have to show that the people have at least failed 3 times on the pills before they'll say, and failed means, in this case, mostly just that you dropped off out of it. But what usually happens is they get re-addicted and they're back at the emergency room again, which was easy to show in the VA because it's a closed system. It's
Right.
much harder to show in a non-closed kind
Yeah,
of
they just
system.
go where they go.
Yeah,
You
they
know,
go all over the place. I mean, we did have some
yeah,
success with that in Houston because there's really only two large municipal kind of acute care emergency. And when the people would come, they would often come with fentanyl overdoses. And so they were, medically quite severe. So you couldn't just, send them to your community hospitals. I mean, they went to the big time level 1 emergency rooms. And so you really only had, you could document that there had been a failure, usually 3 times, fairly readily, easily within a year. And that would be good enough for the Medicare, Medicaid kinds of providers to say, okay, we understand that this may cost, 10 times as much, but it saves, 50 times in what the cost would be otherwise. Not to mention, the patient does better, but that,
that's better.
sometimes an economist, well, there are lots of bad ways to say about how economics works, but the best substance abuser for an economist is a dead one, right? They don't cost anything. So,
Well, it's just funny you mentioned the 3 times because when we did this gold standard interview with Chuck Zarumsky at WashU, it was his argument too that the algorithm for treating depression is backwards. Like, why wouldn't you treat everyone with TMS first? Why would you make people fail on SSRIs and quit and only get partial responses? And it's a sad state of affairs, but let me just get off of that. I can spend my whole time with you on that, and it won't be as good as what I'm going to get to. I mean, yeah, when you like, because so you remind me of depression, and you as a psychiatrist, you may be the role model for addiction psychiatry, in that a lot of your work had to do with treatment outcomes, and special subgroups of patients that might have additional risk. So just like my work in tobacco smoke and secondhand tobacco smoke looked at what the user brought to it. And that's important now because almost all the existing smokers have a psychiatric disease of some sort right now. You looked at
bad to
self
say.
you looked at self-medication for opioids. Um, I'm remembering you did something with my friend Steve Southwick
Yeah.
on PTSD. You've done depression, but I'm very interested in depression because opioids and drugs of abuse in general can cause depression and anhedonia, and at the same time, they're taken to reverse depression. So, how do you separate these chicken or egg arguments?
Well, mostly it has to come down to, it's when a depressed person is first feeling depressed, an awful lot of our drugs of abuse will make them at least forget about their depression temporarily. And you do have to recognize that the treatments for depression 100 years ago were opiates. I mean,
Right.
because the problem is that as you take opiates chronically, you get tolerant and dependent, and the withdrawal syndrome amplifies the depression, if anything. And so the patients who've been, have used opiates as their self-medication have had that experience. It's interesting that they don't necessarily link them together. That is that the opiates now are making you worse, not better. But when you get to that point, I think you then can start to convince them self-medication is an issue, even though, as I said, when you first start these drugs, a lot of people just feel like, it helps them forget about their troubles, which it does. And then if they're a chronic pain patient to begin with, which is how they got on the opiates, well, of course, opiates make chronic pain better, but they have a real limitation in terms of if it's chronic and it's going to go on for months and months, the opiates are not going to be your solution. So I agree with you that this self-medication is an important component, and it unfortunately takes a failure of that self-medication to convince someone that there's another way, and that's the opiates or whatever they're taking, whether it's alcohol or
Right.
those are two of the most common ones, that it's not going to work.
So like I remember, and probably this would overlap with your time with methadone maintenance, that Herb used to like we had two-thirds or three-quarters of the people on methadone were being treated with antidepressants.
It's certainly true that there was a large number of other, psychotropic
Right.
medications. I mean, you may recall your own contribution in terms of lithium in the use with people who are on methadone, right? Which
Yes,
is
yes.
a surprising number of people get their bipolar disorder quite modulated by the opiates, so it just doesn't look that blatant. But if they come off the opiates, it's certainly obvious. And if you
Yeah.
put them on lithium, that the amount of methadone they need even to meal mellow is considerably less.
Right.
And so it's interesting that lithium in general, because no drug company can make any money from it,
Right.
doesn't seem to get as much press, I guess I would say. Well, but that's the way it is. And as far as antidepressants go, as you said, with the SSRIs, things became so safe that
Mhm.
every GP was willing to do it. It was a little different when we were prescribing, imipramine and desipramine and those. And they did have some toxic probability if you overdosed with them. But yeah, no, I think it's still true, by the way, that many of the people who are in methadone or on buprenorphine, certainly within our VA programs, are on psychotropic medications in addition. And they're not benzodiazepines. I mean, they're
Right.
not abusable psychotropics.
Right. No, that's a great point, and thanks for reminding me about lithium, because lithium has just gotten so much press recently about neuroprotection and about age-related memory decline,
Yes.
and it's really a shame that psychiatrists stopped prescribing lithium. Bob Bick used to tell me all the time it's a neuroprotective agent, and here we are almost 50 years after that. It's a neuroprotective agent.
It is interesting that it seems that it's not the lithium chloride, it's not the usual, it's the lithium with a different kind
I
of
I
ligand
saw
bond.
that. You
And
think that's going to be different between the two? And I read the paper, but I didn't I couldn't decide whether that was going to be something that made it different than what we typically would give in psychiatry. But maybe I'm sure you are right about that.
well, it's if nothing else, I mean, they're both over the counter. I mean,
Right.
so you can, in fact, the lithium that's getting the press at the moment is more easily available than lithium, the other lithium, which you have to get the prescription for. So,
Yeah.
um, some strange things happen in the world, and this is one of them where
This is
I do hope lithium gets a second chance with a lot of different things.
yeah. Well, so the pioneering work in opioids, the pioneering work in self-medication, pioneering work in treatment and treatment outcomes, and you then looked at cocaine, and it's interesting because I was interested in prevention from like grassroots prevention, like being on boards of community anti-drug organizations or working on the media partnership uh, This Is Your Brain on Drugs, or for the Ad Council and so forth, thinking about prevention and in this primary prevention sense. And were just much smarter and said, well, what about a vaccine? So when, like, how did that come to you? Like, rather than uh, going down my path in prevention, in I was stuck like you. Like, what are we going to do about cocaine? We don't have a treatment for overdose. We don't have a treatment for craving. We don't have a treatment for relapse prevention. We got nothing. And I said, well, gee, we better just focus on prevention and put money in early childhood prevention and stopping people from using if they've started, and focused on even cocaine pre-addiction before that was a thing. That was really the focus for 800 cocaine. Like, if you have a problem, call 800 cocaine. And we offered education, lived experience, and then what to do if you're addicted. And you took you took the same feeling, like, oh my God, we're lost here, and came up with a biological approach that's been, in essence, your life's work to develop vaccines for addictions, including psychostimulants. So, I mean, it's awesome. As you know, when I introduced you at the DEA, that they still show your teleconference to
Ah,
oh, it's a big part of just their thinking, like, research is really important. And some bright guy like Tom Kosten may actually invent a vaccine and people will be immunized against it. Or maybe we'll have a biological treatment for overdose rather than worried that your brain's going to fry or you're going to have epileptic seizures. So it would be helpful, I think, for the psychiatrists that don't know you and that are watching to get some idea how long it's been that you've worked on this, how hard it's been, and where you are now.
yeah, well, you can't get easily discouraged by lack of success. That's for sure. It's been at least 35 or 40 years working on this. In fact, well, the first ideas I had about it were a little bit of a funny anecdote in that I was at MD PhD with Rockefeller, and I brought up this idea because they had at Rockefeller come up with you could now make an antibody to small molecules. It was for cardiac stuff. And I said, well, wouldn't that be cool for, drugs of abuse? And his response was, you've got a lot of stupid ideas, but that's the stupidest one I ever heard. And so I kind of got discouraged for a while. But then later I ran into some people elsewhere who were immunology focused and, talked to them about it. And they said, well, yeah, we could actually do it. And so we started doing it with tetanus toxoid and other big molecules that you could attach the cocaine to. And it worked reasonably well. We, of course, never got final FDA approval for it because what the FDA wanted was that everybody you vaccinate had to, in fact, that was the placebo comparison. It didn't matter that, in fact, 20% or more, it looked like it's going to be about 30%, just don't make much antibodies to this type of vaccine. Now, what's happened over all the course of this time is we've come up with much better adjuvants that, in fact, make for many more, hopefully people, but certainly animals that will produce very high levels of the antibodies. So that's an improvement. Unfortunately, we had a grant to continue to do that, and fentanyl came along, and NIDA said, stop spending your money on cocaine vaccines. It's a problem, but not big enough. So anyway, so we shifted to fentanyl vaccines. We did do a fentanyl vaccine. It's been, it was getting ready to go into people here in the United States. And then the anti-vaxxer alliance became a big issue. We found a company that would be happy to work with us to develop it in Europe, which is what's happening right now. The anti-fentanyl vaccine is going into people in Europe and being manufactured there. And it looks like it will. It makes basically 10 times more antibody than the original kinds of ways we were doing it. The same thing is true of cocaine. We have another grant with NIDA that's pending. It got a fundable score, but like everything that says vaccine in the name of it is on hold. Now, whether that will happen or not, I'm very optimistic it will. It takes the same strategy as we did with the fentanyl one, makes immensely more amount of antibody. And what we don't know yet is, will it in fact get that 20% or so that wouldn't make antibodies? Will they in fact make antibodies? And they might. Now, certainly with the fentanyl, it looks like that's going to happen, but cocaine's a different kind of molecule that unfortunately seems to make, in some people, your body tolerate cocaine as if it's, carrots or something, that it's a normal constituent that you should be able to eat. And you make these very low affinity antibodies to it that prevent you from making the kind of antibodies you need to have a treatment. I think the other question, though, is, what about prevention? When we first started doing this, I was on a committee for the National Academy of Sciences where we were looking at the ethical issues of these, long-term interventions. And on the cocaine vaccines or an opiate vaccine, there was a split between the public health people and the parents group, sort of on one side, and then the ethicists on the other side, where the issue was, who could you vaccinate? Could you vaccinate kids? Could you vaccinate people before they were in fact addicted? And the people in the ACLU and other ethicists said, oh no, that would be terrible, that you would mark them forever by having this antibody that they have in them. And, okay, but if everybody has it, who's going to care?
Right.
So on the other hand, the parents groups and the public health people wanted us to basically put it in the drinking water,
Right.
that everybody would get it. And what's the problem? So again, one of the mayors of a somewhat liberal city, I won't say who was part of this group, came up with a very fascinating suggestion having to do with herd immunity, which is something you usually think about in cattle. But
Yeah.
what it is if you get a certain percentage of people vaccinated, then it doesn't transmit from one to the other. So if you vaccinated, let's say, even 60 or so percent of the inner city people, the dealers would no longer work with them because they'd have too many people that were failures and they'd get their kneecaps broken. So they would instead move out into the suburbs where they would then sell their cocaine because there weren't that many vaccinated people. And this was even before the anti-vaxxers came along. But then with the problem, not in the inner city, but in fact, out in the suburbs, there'd be real motivation to want to get this going again, and potentially for vaccinating, as you're saying, a prevention kind of way. And so that, we ended up a whole book on how this is an ethical issue. But yes, I think it may come up even with the fentanyl vaccine, that this is life and death kind of thing. And, don't you want to have those high school kids who are trying out a drug that, right now fentanyl occurs in cocaine, it occurs in amphetamine, it occurs in benzodiazepines, these manufactured benzodiazepines that aren't really it, never mind the opiates themselves. So it's become quite a broad fatality factor. And
I
it's
agree.
the one with the fentanyl mixed in with the stimulants is the biggest problem right now.
Sure.
That there's more deaths with that combination than with fentanyl alone.
Well, see, we continued that, and me too. On the DEA side, we had like one pill can kill campaign, which is basically the manufactured Xanax has fentanyl in it, and one pill, a bootleg pill, one counterfeit pill can kill you. So in a way, we're working in the same area, but
Yeah.
it's I feel your frustration, but it is really amazing and a compliment to just you and your tenacity to see this all the way through from concept at Rockefeller to animal models to people. And just this week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just saying, isn't it amazing? Americans just still love cocaine. And we see that in Florida, the you can have all the methamphetamine supply, and it can even go through our state, but there's no way that it's being used in clubs. It's cocaine. It's the price of cocaine is an aphrodisiac. Forget cocaine. Um, I know that your work is going to be referenced forever. It's widely referenced already. Yeah, it's just great work, and I'm sure it'll be widely referenced forever. And I did notice, by the way, in one of these AI services where they rank the addiction medicine like opinion leaders or who's who's the most influential, that you're very high on that list. I mean, it's kind of
You,
did
thank you.
you?
You sent that to me. I was shocked.
Yeah,
My
well,
children said, I didn't even know you did this kind of stuff,
me or you?
Yeah, no,
Oh,
no. That's what my children said to me. Said, oh, I mean, people know who you are.
yes, exactly. Like there's some areas where your work is so seminal that everyone has to refer to it. And that's really what they're looking at. It's not the total mass of publications, it's whose work changed the field. Well, I mean, Einstein didn't have certainly whole fields were changed. And I just think on the vaccine side, it's been very important for people to understand that as we do research and figure out where drugs act in the brain, people can develop vaccines. People can uh, change, and prevention might not just be a TV commercial for one pill can kill or 800 cocaine or this is your brain on drugs. It could be a vaccine. How remarkable would that be?
Well, what's good is that us doctors seem to agree that vaccines are a great contribution that we've made to, public health and
Definitely.
medicine and everything else. If we could convince some of the people who are leading our organizations at the moment that
Yeah. Well, like we'll get we just have to live long enough. I'm sure
there you go.
there's definitely a German saying about this that my grandfather had, and I could check with Wayne to see if he feels the same way. But it's mostly like things come and go. You have to do the right thing and live long enough, and then you'll get to see that it all works out. Let me ask a couple more things before you go, since you're a world's expert. Um, uh, when we had one DEA program with the Yale inventors on ketamine, and I brought them down and showed people like you could have a safe and effective Spravato without diversion, just like you mentioned, that worked for TRD, treatment-resistant depression. That's not a surprise, even if ketamine is a drug of abuse, even if ketamine use disorder is a real thing, even if it might be mixed in clubs and people die, but no matter how long we discuss this with Kevin Hill and others there, it's been 50 years and they haven't been able to come up with any use for cannabis or THC or really CBD that is more than just palliative care for a rare neurological disorder.
It is striking. I think the that you would think that with all the different derivatives of cannabidiol that you would in fact come up with something that would be that would be maybe as dramatic as ketamine, but certainly some of the other hallucinogen work that's coming out now is just uh, the LSD is perhaps the most incredible example in that Sandoz made
Definitely.
LSD and they made it at the urging of psychiatrists who were trying to figure out how could you make psychoanalysis go a lot quicker? How could you get at that unconscious? And my God, LSD does do that. Unfortunately, Timothy Leary carried that to the absurd degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, take it every day for breakfast, But in fact, now that we're back to the sort of sensible, use that we may well have that there is in fact a real role for this, but it's going to be a very controlled kind of setting. And if you look at the results in the placebo-controlled studies with
GAD.
psilocybin, with
Oh, yeah.
LSD.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just striking. I mean, how much it makes PTSD and depression better. And even they've given it to substance abusers and made them better, which who would guess?
Yeah. I mean, this is really a great place to discuss because my lab, and I work with George Agajanian, and he did single unit recording for LSD. And his
Yeah.
work led to our work on clonidine and your work on clonidine lofexidine, and his his work led to ketamine.
Yeah.
So, like, he's the unsung missing link in a lot of the progress in biological psychiatry today, if you ask me.
No, George Agajanian was truly a very humble genius and had
Good.
lots of discoveries that not only, moved his career along, but lots of other people who got to work with him.
Yeah. Like very kind. And it's just an interesting, you mentioned the LSD, of course, it's I guess it's in phase 3 for GAD. And I think psilocybin is
Yeah.
not far behind and probably going to have some end of life use in addition to
Yes.
depression. But last up for me is so, for psilocybin, you bring this up. For psilocybin, they're trying to get it approved like ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. Um, how come we don't have like treatment-resistant opioid use disorder? Why do we make people do the same treatment 20 times?
Yes, that there does seem to be a moralistic view of opiate dependence and substance abuse disorders in general, which luckily doesn't permeate depression and psychosis and the things which, of course, it did 200 years ago or 150 years ago. So I think we're maybe making some progress across the board that, addictions are brain diseases and it alters your brain, and your brain, in fact, may in fact be predisposed in some cases, and so you might say you can't help yourself. And I think that knowledge maybe permeate the system soonest with perhaps alcohol, and I think it certainly should with nicotine and smoking. I mean, what's happening now with vaping and young people is just astounding. We just finished a paper where we were looking at it in adolescents who were in college age kids, and the rates of suicidality, the rates of complications from smoking tobacco, cigarettes, were identical with those people that only vaped. I mean, it's like, well, okay, what's the good part about vaping? Sorry. So yeah, I think that
Where was
we're on.
that paper, by the way?
We hope to have it coming out in, I think it's going to be Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, but
That's
it's there.
great. Yeah, I know. I
Yeah.
think the main arguments are one of these tricky arguments, like, well, you don't have the same toxic exposure that you do to tobacco cigarettes.
Well, you don't get cancer from it, but instead you get heavy metal diseases. It ends up in those things. So you can't be, it's not just the nicotine, but the nicotine all by itself has its
Definitely.
toxicities.
Yeah, well, we our smoking model was always using vaporized nicotine anyway when we did tobacco studies, and um, that's interesting. So just to end up, is there anything that we should be looking for in the field of like big breakthroughs? Uh,
Well, I think that they're very similar to what's happening in depression, quite frankly, which is, the ketamine story, the revisiting hallucinogenic drugs. I mean, depression's always, you might say a few years ahead of what's happening in substance abuse, just because there aren't that many of us that do research in substance abuse. And then it's like in molecular biology that we're learning more and more that's useful from cancer research, right? Because there's such a
sure.
huge investment in that. And that's one of the areas that I've been interested in the last 5, 6 years, which is microRNAs, which are ways to regulate DNA expression. It's an epigenetic mechanism, but unlike DNA methylation, which there are millions of sites for, there's only about 2,500 microRNAs that regulate, each one can regulate up to 100 different genes. And so we're discovering pathways from that, many of which we think are, well, we know that are now are relevant for suicide and other things. So we may end up with, and they rapidly come out of the brain into the blood where they stay put. So there's some nice markers that are showing up for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's already, but I think we're going to see them for psychiatric disorders in the not too distant future. And that will mean a whole kind of therapeutics, because these are only 17, bases long. So they're very small molecules that you can even get them orally and they'll get into your brain. So
That's really interesting.
it will be quite interesting and exciting to see that happen. And there's like 4 companies around the country that are now beginning to do this, not for brain diseases, interestingly, but for other diseases, because microRNAs are all over your body. But the use of this for Alzheimer's disease is one that's beginning, and Parkinson's is beginning to take shape, because there are particular DNA, genes essentially that particularly associated with Parkinson's disease that you can turn them off with a microRNA. And if you do, in the animal models at least now, they don't get Parkinson's, even though they would be susceptible. So yeah, I think that biology and biological, as opposed to just small molecules, may well be the future.
Well, that's just great. I want to just thank you again, Tom, for like joining us on the gold standard. I mean, you are the
Pleasure.
gold standard, and we're just so proud that you're both a psychiatrist and an addiction expert, and just so willing to share with everyone. Have just a great
Thank you.
weekend.
You too. Bye now.